In 1942, deep in the heart of Germany, Luftwaffe pilots gathered around briefing tables with quiet confidence. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were sleek, deadly, and battle-proven. The skies over Europe still belonged to them, and when word came that the Americans were sending a new fighter into the war, a massive, overweight brute called the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, they laughed. They called it the milk jug. Too fat, too slow, too heavy to ever climb or fight above the clouds. A flying brick, they said. But in time, that laughter would fade, replaced by disbelief, and then by fear. The P-47 wasn't born elegant. It was born out of necessity. By 1942, American engineers faced a grim problem. Bombers were dying faster than they could be built. The B-17 Flying Fortress could carry death to Germany, but without protection, it was a slow, high-flying target. Escort fighters like the P-40 and P-39 simply couldn't reach Berlin. The Air Corps needed something that could fly high, fly long, and take punishment that would rip lesser aircraft apart. Republic Aviation, led by Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant with a stubborn belief in brute force design, answered that call. His creation would weigh more than 8 tons when loaded, driven by the largest piston engine ever bolted onto a fighter, the 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It was an engine that didn't purr, it thundered. Producing over 2,000 horsepower, it demanded a plane built around it, not the other way around. Kartveli's Thunderbolt was massive, with a fuselage wide enough to house a train wheel. The cockpit sat high like a fortress turret, wrapped in armor. Its wings carried 8 .50-caliber Browning machine guns, 4 on each side, capable of unleashing a river of lead that could cut a bomber or tank to shreds. Engineers called it overbuilt. Pilots would call it a miracle. When it first entered service in early 1943, though few believed in it, even some American pilots doubted the Thunderbolt. They wanted something nimble, like the British Spitfire. Instead, they got a beast that took half the runway to lift off and climbed like a bus loaded with bricks. The early missions of the 56th Fighter Group out of England were rough. P-47s burned fuel fast, struggled to reach bomber altitude in time, and couldn't yet make it to the target and back. The Luftwaffe mocked them, calling the P-47 the Thunderbox. But what the Germans didn't understand yet was what this machine could endure, and what it could deliver once it reached its stride. By mid-1943, the P-47's weaknesses began to fade, as its pilots learned to fight differently. Its weight wasn't a curse, it was armor. Its power wasn't wasted, it was momentum. The P-47 was no dogfighter in tight turns, but in a dive, it became a falling hammer. Pilots like Francis Gabby Gabreski and Robert S. Johnson began using altitude and speed as their weapons. They'd climb high above the bomber streams, then plunge through enemy formations at over 500 miles per hour, guns blazing, before the Luftwaffe even knew what hit them. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than anything in the sky. So fast, in fact, that early models tore their control surfaces clean off. Once engineers fixed that, it became a predator that struck like lightning. Robert Johnson's story became legend. In June 1943, returning from a mission over France, his P-47 was ambushed by German ace Egon Meyer. Cannon shells ripped through his fuselage, the cockpit filled with smoke, and his canopy jammed shut. He was trapped inside a burning aircraft, wounded, unable to bail out. Meyer SFW 190 circled around for the kill and emptied every gun into the Thunderbolt. Shells sparked off armor. Tracers tore through the wings. But Johnson refused to die. His engine kept running, oil leaking, control cables severed. Meyer eventually ran out of ammunition and saluted before breaking away. Johnson somehow brought that wrecked P-47 home, landing safely in England. Mechanics counted over 200 bullet and cannon holes in the plane. The German ace had scored direct hits that would have shredded any other fighter. The Thunderbolt had simply refused to fall. Stories like that spread fast. Suddenly, pilots began to trust the brute. They realized they could take risks no other plane could survive. The P-47 could dive through flak, strafe trains, tanks, and convoys, and still make it home with holes in its wings big enough to crawl through. On the ground, its 8 .50 caliber guns turned it into a flying buzzsaw. A single 1-second burst could put 40 rounds into an enemy aircraft or shred a panzer column in seconds. By early 1944, the Thunderbolt had become the backbone of the U.S. 8th Air Force. Its range was extended with drop tanks, finally allowing it to escort bombers deep into Germany. Now, those same Luftwaffe pilots who had mocked it found themselves hunted by it. German aces like Adolf Galland began warning their units not to underestimate the Jug, a nickname born from Juggernaut. They called it that for good reason. It didn't just fight. It absorbed punishment and delivered it back tenfold. When the 56th Fighter Group began to rack up kills, the statistics became impossible to ignore. Gabreski scored 28 victories in his P-47, becoming America's top ace in the European theater. Hubert Zemke, commanding the same group, drilled his men in high-speed hit-and-run tactics, boom and zoom attacks that played perfectly to the P-47's strengths. The Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them, and every month the Thunderbolt's kill counts climbed higher. Meanwhile, in the skies over Italy and France, the P-47 found a second life as a ground attack monster. Once longer-range P-51 Mustangs arrived to escort bombers to Berlin, the Thunderbolt was reassigned to low-altitude warfare. It excelled. Its air-cooled radial engine could take ground fire that would knock a liquid-cooled P-51 out of the sky. Pilots flew nap of the earth, screaming over hedgerows, strafing convoys, blasting bridges, and knocking out locomotives with rockets and bombs. German soldiers came to fear the sound of that distinctive turbo-supercharged whine, a deep, rolling growl that meant death was coming. In Normandy, after D-Day, Thunderbolts became the scourge of German armor. From dawn to dusk, they prowled the front lines, hitting anything that moved. They carried 500-pound bombs under each wing, plus rockets and full ammo belts for their 8 guns. Tank crews often abandoned their vehicles at the first sight of jugs overhead. The Thunderbolt's ability to loiter above the battlefield, absorb flak, and deliver precise strikes turned it into a flying artillery piece. Even General Patton called it one of the greatest weapons in our arsenal. But its dominance wasn't just in numbers or technology. It was in the transformation of those who flew it. Pilots who once sneered at its bulk grew protective of it. They learned to trust its weight, to feel the way its power surged through the control stick when they pushed the throttle forward. Many described it as a beast that looked after you if you treated it right. Some came home alive because of that armor, because of that overbuilt fuselage that Kartveli had insisted upon. For the Germans, the P-47 marked a turning point. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The once feared Jagdgeschwader 26 and 2, units that had boasted aces like Galland and Marseille, were now scattered, flying desperate sorties against waves of Thunderbolts and Mustangs. Many Luftwaffe veterans would later admit that the P-47 changed the tone of the air war. Its presence meant the Americans could now strike anywhere, anytime, with impunity. The skies no longer belonged to Germany, and yet, for all its brutality, the P-47 carried a kind of poetic irony. It began as a laughingstock, a machine too heavy for war, and became the hammer that shattered the Reich's air defenses. Its pilots didn't seek glamour. They flew missions that blurred the line between survival and madness. Some were shot down in flames over France. Others limped home on engines coughing black smoke, landing on strips littered with wrecks of yesterday's fights. They weren't T-heroes in shining aircraft. They were men in steel beasts that screamed through hell and came back for more. As the war dragged into its final year, the Thunderbolt's reputation was sealed. Over 15,000 were built, one of the most produced American fighters in history. It destroyed more than 6,000 enemy aircraft in air combat, and thousands more on the ground. In Europe alone, its pilots dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, more than half of all the bombs dropped by U.S. fighters. It was a weapon of endurance, a symbol of industrial might turned into airborne wrath. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, many of those pilots returned home and spoke of the Jug not with affection, but with respect, a kind of reverence reserved for something that had carried them through death and back. They remembered the vibration in their bones when the R-2800 came alive, the smell of cordite after firing all 8 guns, the sight of tracers arcing into the enemy's wings, and the long, shaking silence that followed when the battle was over. And somewhere, across the ruins of Germany, Luftwaffe veterans spoke in the same tone. They remembered the first time they dove on what they thought was an easy kill, a clumsy American brute, and how it turned, dived, and unleashed fire with impossible fury. They remembered how the flying milk jug became the steel storm that ended their reign. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't win the war alone, but it carved its name into the thunder of history. It taught the world that beauty doesn't win battles, survival does. That strength, resilience, and sheer willpower could turn laughter into fear, and long after the echoes of war faded, its legacy remained in the memories of those who once looked up and saw it blot out the sun, heavy, unyielding, and unstoppable. The Germans had laughed at the Thunderbolt once, but when its 8 Brownings roared and the sky rained lead, the laughter died beneath the storm it brought.